Between Nigeria in the east and Senegal in the northwest, 8 nations occupy the West African coastline. The largest of these nations is Ivory Coast, or Côte d'Ivoire. As a crossroads of transatlantic trade across the sea and trans-Saharan trade across the desert, Ivory Coast has been central to the economic and political landscape of this part of the world for centuries. Sometimes, this position has bestowed great blessings upon the land and its people. Gold, ideas, and commodities have all flowed freely across what is now Ivory Coast. At other times, it's brought curses, not least the slave trade and colonial interest from the nations of Western Europe. While this position on the coast of West Africa has shaped centuries of Ivorian history, it's the influence and ideas of just a handful of men that have guided the nation's course in the last few decades. This is the story of how a desire for power and control once again spilled over into bloodshed and turmoil, and how ideas like national identity and cultural supremacy quite literally tore a nation in two. This is the story of Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. While you're here with us, we'd like to invite you to explore our Ko-fi page. If you don't know what Ko-fi is, it's essentially Patreon without all the censorship and political baggage. Your support on Ko-fi directly fuels our ability to produce unique and exciting content that might otherwise remain hidden in the depths of the YouTube algorithm. In fact, some of our existing videos, like the ones on the Chaco War, the Beagle conflict, and Maurice Cohen's incredible journey, haven't received the recognition we believe they truly deserve. But we're determined not to shy away from such important topics, even if they might not align with the algorithm's preferences for promotion. With your support on Ko-fi, we can give videos like these a second chance, ensuring that these valuable stories and insights reach a wider audience without any concerns about our profitability month by month. We also haven't forgotten to include some awesome weekly and monthly perks for our supporters, so make sure you check out the link below. The trans-Saharan trade networks that flourished in the late medieval and early modern periods brought prosperity to the lands now known as Ivory Coast or Côte d'Ivoire. While the Ghanaian and Malayan empires were the dominant forces in the region, independent kingdoms flourished in these parts of West Africa, and the Malinke people brought with them the new faith and philosophy of Islam from the north and west. When the Great Malian Empire collapsed in the 16th century, the region destabilized, and new kingdoms sprung up in these lands. Buna was one, as was Kong. The Abron kingdom of Gyaman and the Bolek kingdom would follow. The growing Asante Empire brought conquest and imperial control to this part of West Africa in the 18th century, but it would be colonialism of a different kind that rocked these shores in the following century. At first, the Portuguese and the French stuck to the coastlines, but France would have absorbed all of what is now Ivory Coast into its empire by the end of the 19th century. It was the vast resource wealth that drove the French further inland, and their exploitative tactics enriched the empire at the expense of local communities. To harvest these resources, the French instituted a policy of forced labor. When this wasn't enough, they began to import laborers from nearby Upper Volta, modern-day Burkina Faso. These heavy-handed approaches, with little regard for the human cost, would lay the groundwork for the tensions and rifts that would strike the country post-independence. Ivorians fought and died alongside the French in the First World War, the forced conscription leading to significant revolts that would not be fully quelled until 1918. Yet, significant French investment began to transform the lands in the years that followed. Remaining under the control of Vichy France as the Second World War broke out, the experience of indigenous Ivorians during the 1940s was a wretched one, and this hardship led to a real push for independence in the post-war years. As World War II ended, Félix Houphouët-Boigny emerged as a political leader in the developing colony, founding the African Farmers Union, or the SAA, in 1944 and going on to serve in the French Assembly in 1946, where he promoted a law banning forced labor in the colonies. It would not be until 1960 that independence was granted. Houphouët-Boigny, a former minister in the French Parliament, began the first of his 7 terms in office as president of the fledgling nation. It would be Houphouët-Boigny's death in 1993 that catalyzed the series of events that plunged Ivory Coast into turmoil once again. The 1980s brought an economic storm to the Ivory Coast. The nation relied on revenue from its key exports of coffee and cocoa, but a slump in global commodity prices made it difficult for Ivorian businesses to compete on the world stage. Drought racked the country further, while the Ivory Coast citizens struggled with mounting personal debt. Fluctuations in the commodity market brought a series of booms and busts, and a divestment program proved disastrous, siphoning much-needed funds out of the Ivory Coast. There was also political and ethnic tensions. The idea of Ivoirité, essentially the true nature and characteristics of a genuine Ivorian, was a major issue in the country. To begin with, Ivoirité was something similar to the American dream, a general philosophy of what it means to be Ivorian that all could engage with, no matter where they'd come from. As time passed, however, the term became a rallying point for nationalistic and xenophobic elements in Ivorian society, and it was used to exclude the immigrants and foreign-born individuals who made up 1/3 of the country's population. The death of President Houphouët-Boigny in 1993 plunged the Ivory Coast into further political turmoil. While the economy did rally in the mid-90s, recovery was torpedoed by a military coup in 1999, which ousted Houphouët-Boigny's successor, Henri Konan Bédié. There was little optimism in Ivory Coast at the dawn of the new millennium. Former military commander Robert Gué held onto power following the coup and refused to relinquish this power even after presidential elections in 2000. While Laurent Gbagbo won this election, Gué's security forces would kill hundreds and injure thousands before a transition could take place. Ivorians were now looking at the very real prospects of a civil war. This civil war would begin less than 2 years later with another military rebellion in September 2002. Rebel forces struck 3 Ivorian cities on September 19th, including the largest metropolis, Abidjan. Chaos reigned. At some point in those opening hours, Gué was shot dead, while forces in support of the rebel Guillaume Soro and his patriotic movement of Côte d'Ivoire, or MPCI, failed to take their key objective of Abidjan. Gbagbo began an immediate crackdown on the rebels, even destroying the homes of thousands of immigrants accused of supporting the insurrection. The long-threatened civil war was now underway. Abidjan was still in government hands, but on their retreat back to the north, the MPCI succeeded in taking over vast swaths of Ivorian territory, including the cities of Bouaké and Korogo. Ivory Coast was essentially split in two. 3 days later, on September 22nd, France launched Opération Licorne, a protective and peacekeeping measure according to the French government, and certainly not an intervention. French involvement would prove to be a critical factor over the coming years, as government and rebel sides sought sometimes to exploit the French presence and at other times to outmaneuver it. Later, there would be direct clashes between French and Ivorian troops. But first, there would be attempts at peace. Several attempts, in fact. Between October and December, there was a partial ceasefire as representatives of a number of West African states sought to broker an end to the conflict. The talks went nowhere, and by the end of the year, 2 more rebel groups had entered the fray: the Movement for Justice and Peace, or MJP, and the Ivorian Popular Movement of the Great West, the MPIGO. The murder of Robert Gué, allegedly orchestrated by the government at their first opportunity, was a major sticking point. Further talks throughout the first half of 2003 culminated in mass protests against the so-called French occupation, and eventually a UN peacekeeping mission in May. On July 4th, 2003, government and rebel forces announced an end to the conflict. According to the Linas-Marcoussis Accord, laid down back in January, the opposing sides would implement a power-sharing deal through a government of national reconciliation. And yet, violence continued throughout the summer. In August, the French forces suffered their first casualties as 2 soldiers were killed. Back in the French capital, 10 people were arrested in Paris after an apparent plot to assassinate Gbagbo. The First Ivorian Civil War was supposedly over, but political turmoil and even out-and-out violence was still very much part of the reality of the Ivory Coast. It was early November 2004 when the fractious ceasefire finally broke down. Ivory Coast was still largely divided between the government-held and nominally Christian/animist South and the rebel-held primarily Muslim North, while the MCPI, the MPIGO, and MJP had largely coalesced into the new forces of the Ivory Coast, or FNCI, back in December of 2002. On November 4th, Gbagbo ordered a counter-offensive of the rebel town of Bouaké. The operation would be backed, Gbagbo ordered, by airstrikes. 2 days later, government Sukhoi Su-25 bombers took to the skies over Bouaké. Crewed by Ivorian pilots, along with mercenaries from Belarus, the Su-25s fired upon a rebel position. What happened next is unclear, but at least one of the Su-25s unleashed its payload upon French peacekeeping forces in the town, killing 9 soldiers as well as an American civilian conducting scientific research in the area. French President Jacques Chirac was outraged, claiming an intentional assault on his forces, while Gbagbo claimed the strike had been accidental. The French response was immediate. When the Su-25s landed at Abidjan an hour later, they were assaulted by the French 2nd Marine Infantry Regiment, who were then themselves assaulted by a helicopter gunship. Violence began to break out across the city. Civilians took to the streets in protest, marching on the airport and on a French military base. Government troops and French forces engaged in a firefight, while rocket-propelled grenades struck a French transport aircraft. French troops also set about destroying government planes and helicopters around the airport as the protesters broke through into the terminal buildings. Over the coming days, thousands of protesters assaulted French targets around Abidjan. France stepped up its evacuations of French citizens in the country and used helicopters, armored cars, and gunboats to subdue the unrest. At least 20, and some records say 60, Ivorian civilians were killed as French troops opened fire on protesters, and other deaths of both military personnel and civilians were reported across Abidjan. The situation calmed after November 7th, and an arms embargo on Ivory Coast was initiated a week later. However, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, whose citizens had been directly involved in the airstrikes, helped Gbagbo and his government rebuild their air force in the months following the action. Operation Licorne, or Unicorn, did not begin with the 2004 clashes, nor did it end there. For 13 years, French forces remained active in Ivory Coast, conducting peacekeeping missions, maintaining the security of French civilians and businesses, and, occasionally, getting involved in the fighting themselves. The Licorne operation was carried out by battalion task groups, known as GTIAs, operating alongside the UNOSI, the United Nations' own peacekeeping force. Until 2008, there were 3 of these GTIAs, but a shift in policy after this point saw a restructuring of military activities in Ivory Coast. Some accuse the French government of exceeding their remit in Ivory Coast. After the Ivorian-French clashes in 2004, the country's National Assembly President, Mamadou Coulibaly, told Ivorian state television that Ivory Coast has become an overseas territory in Jacques Chirac's head, suggesting that the ongoing Opération Licorne was as much an exercise in neocolonialism as it was a peacekeeping action. Documents released by WikiLeaks support this view to an extent. In 2005, a telegram was sent from the United States Embassy in Paris outlining France's bitterness over the situation in Ivory Coast, which was, in the words of the telegram itself, once a crown jewel of France-Afrique. The death of Houphouët Boigny in 1993, one of France-Afrique's biggest advocates and beneficiaries, according to the leak, sent the situation into a downward spiral. The telegram went on to describe a unilateral military intervention in the old style, which allegedly cost France around 250 million euros a year. Others took a more pragmatic approach, believing that as long as French presence avoided a second Ivorian civil war, then perhaps it was justifiable. There was hope for ongoing, if fragile, peace, but these hopes would prove futile in November 2010. As polls closed on the first round of presidential elections on October 31st, 2010, no one quite knew what was going on. There had been significant interest in the elections. Turnout was reported to be around 80%, and several thousand expatriate Ivorians had cast their ballots from abroad. but no one could agree on who was in the lead. Some put current President Laurent Gbagbo in first place. Others placed former leader Henrique Nambedi at the head of the pack. Some news outlets pulled for ex-Prime Minister Alassane Ouattara. All the uncertainty would have been farcical if the mood wasn't so tense. The second round went ahead on November 28th. The following day, the expatriate ballots were counted and the figures were released. This early count had Ouattara as the initial leader with 6,371 votes to Gbagbo's 4,252, a tiny fraction in an election which millions of people had turned out to vote. But to Gbagbo's supporters, this was a big deal. They began to cry foul, claiming that Ouattara supporters in the north were manipulating the count. On November 30th, attempts were made to announce more results, but Gbagbo supporters sabotaged the press conference and destroyed the papers. Then things began to get even uglier. On December 1st, reports emerged of 8 Ouattara supporters allegedly shot dead in Abidjan, a city loyal to Gbagbo. With long-standing ethnic and political tensions not yet resolved, the Ivory Coast had been a tinderbox of simmering resentment and distrust for years. An attempt at a democratic process in 2010 had thrown a lit match into that tinder. Gbagbo declared his Ivorian People's Front Party as the winner. Ouattara proclaimed his own rally of the Republicans Party as the new governing power. Neither accepted the other's claims, and militants on both sides returned to the battle lines. Sporadic violence broke out all over Ivory Coast in the first 3 months of 2011, but it was Abidjan where it found its focus. This was Gbagbo territory, but the largest Ivorian city also had its fair share of Ouattara supporters. There were constant clashes as security forces sought to keep control of their main power base. Summary arrests, beatings, maimings, and even executions were reported as violence gripped the country. In the west of the country, the militias had been waiting for the chance to strike. In February, they took it, supporting the new forces of the rebels as they took Djoukwe, Daloa, and Zouan Hunin. Throughout March, they pushed on, taking more Gbagbo strongholds and growing in power and confidence. By the end of March, the rebel army had a new name, Republican Forces of Côte d'Ivoire, or RFCI, and a new objective. The end was in sight, and one last push, they believed, would topple Gbagbo for good. On the 28th, the borders were locked down. On the 30th, the UN issued a plea for all parties to recognize the status of Alassane Ouattara as Ivorian president. On the 31st, Abidjan was surrounded and about to fall. Thousands of RFCI troops poured into Abidjan. A curfew was called, and UN peacekeeping forces moved in to secure infrastructure like the airport and hopefully to prevent further loss of civilian life. For several days, there was heavy fighting, most of it concentrated around Gbagbo's palace, where his elite units remained in place to protect their leader. Ouattara called upon Gbagbo's troops to let down their arms and join their brothers. Some did, but others remained at their posts. By April 5th, the UN and French troops had begun firing on Gbagbo positions in an attempt to bring the situation to an end. By now, there was little left of Gbagbo's army, but the president was still holed up in his residence under siege on all sides. He held out for almost another week before Ouattara's men stormed the palace on April 11th, aided by French helicopters and armored vehicles. Gbagbo and around 50 others were arrested. The Second Ivorian Civil War was over. The first conflict had raged for 4 years. This one, only 4 months. And yet, this was still plenty of time for fighters to make their bloody mark upon the nation, and particularly upon its civilian population. Around 1,000 civilians were reported murdered in Djoukwe, with both Ouattara's and Gbagbo's forces blamed. Liberian militias in the west of the country were accused of murdering some 40 people whose bodies were recovered from Bleu-les-Quins in the final days of the war. Another 60 bodies were found at Giglo, victims of a power struggle that had almost nothing to do with them. Mass graves were also uncovered at Touleple. A war does not need to be long and drawn out to exact a heavy toll on civilians. The grim scenes of the Second Ivorian Civil War shocked many international observers. Although his RFCI forces were far from blameless, Ouattara did gain the benefit of global support as the conflict reached its bloody conclusion, and he was soon proclaimed Ivory Coast's new leader. In the aftermath of the Second Civil War, there have been attempts at healing in Ivory Coast. Alassane Ouattara won a second election and then controversially fought and won a third, despite some claiming this to be unconstitutional. As of 2023, he remains as president of Ivory Coast, 13 years after the disputed elections that launched the horrors of 2010 and 11. In October 2023, Ouattara won a landslide victory in the local elections and promptly dissolved his government, ready for a reshuffle that he hopes will consolidate his power. The next presidential elections are 2 years away, and it is possible that Ouattara plans to extend his unprecedented run of election victories with a fourth term. Laurent Gbagbo stood accused at the International Criminal Court, but was acquitted of the charges brought against him. In 2022, his associate, Charles Blé Goudet, also charged and acquitted at the ICC, returned to the Ivorian political stage after years in exile. The return of Goudet came shortly after a meeting between Ouattara and his former opponents Laurent Gbagbo and Henri Konan Bedie, for the first time since the elections in 2010. At the top political levels, it seems there's still hope for reconciliation. But what about elsewhere in the country? After all, it's civilians who pay the price for political posturing and enthusiastic generalship, and thousands were horribly murdered across 2 civil wars and decades of unrest. How is Ivory Coast's social fabric holding up more than a decade on? In those first years after the ceasefire, there was immense anger. Ivory Coast had been ripped apart. Concepts of Ivoite, or the so-called genuine nature of true Ivorians, coupled with the tension between southern Christians and northern Muslims, made for a horrifying situation. Reports of war crimes and mass murder abounded, and the desire for justice was strong. However, the need for political stability and a new dawn for the country proved stronger. Goudet and Gbagbo were both acquitted, and many others escaped justice too. Instead, a newly functioning political machine in Ivory Coast turned its attention to legislation and social changes, bringing an end to the contentious issues of national identity and status that had caused so much bloodshed in the first place. After a spate of Islamist attacks from groups linked to Al-Qaeda in 2015 and 2016, the need for a galvanized and unified national security response became clear, and a pragmatic, forward-thinking Ivory Coast began to form out of the ashes. Scars remain. We often hear of atrocities committed within living memory and the simmering resentment just below the surface. In Ivory Coast, these atrocities are not just within living memory. They're just a decade and a half old in many cases. The danger of renewed violence and rewind bloodshed remains real. There's a long way to go before Ivory Coast can truly consider itself healed, but its ongoing path to recovery has to be viewed in the context of a nightmarish few decades. Ivory Coast, as an independent nation, has suffered greatly. Is the pursuit of justice, or perhaps retribution, the right way to go? Or is it better to try and rebuild a nation that all Ivorians can live safely and prosperously within, regardless of whether they, or their parents, or their grandparents were born in the country? What do you think? What does the future hold for Ivory Coast? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.